Welcome back. In this video, we'll talk about how to cram for the ACT Science section. This is a great video to watch right before you take the test because it's all about short-term memory. Cram in what you can and then forget it all as soon as you leave the test. This might be a little longer than my typical videos, but it's a great crash course for some of the most popular science topics that have appeared on recent ACT tests. Basically, it's 4 years of science crammed into about 20 minutes. And you guys know the drill by now. If you find this helpful, please hit that like button, share, and subscribe. And be sure to leave a comment down below to let us know if you spotted any of these topics on your test, or let us know what other random science topics popped up. Okay, let's cram for the ACT Science section. Now some ground rules to start. I'm going to cover these topics fairly quickly. This is meant to be a quick cram session, not a formal science lesson, so you can press pause on any screen where you want to jot down any terms or definitions. Also, 2 points of full disclosure before we start. Number 1, these questions that deal with outside scientific knowledge don't make up the bulk of your science score. Most ACT science questions want you to interpret data from graphs, tables, and experiments. Check out my video here, where I cover the best tips and tricks to help with these types of questions. Which leads to disclosure number 2. I have no idea if any of these topics will come up on your test. The ACT Science section is not like the Math and the Grammar sections where we can anticipate what material is considered fair game. They throw in different topics on every test. That said, I've done a lot of work on analyzing the ACTs from the last 2 decades, so even though it's very difficult to predict what topics might be in play for the next round, this video is a great crash course of what random topics have popped up on the recent tests. And I'll also hit some related topics that are in that family. For example, a recent test question wanted you to know that proteins are made up of amino acids. So it's conceivable that a future test question might want you to know that carbohydrates are made up of simple sugars. This way, we'll cover what topics have appeared on recent tests, as well as other related topics that might be fair game for your test. Okay, here we go. Many ACT science questions want you to define the components of an experiment, so it's very helpful to be familiar with these terms. The independent variable, which is what is being manipulated, or what the scientists control. The dependent variable, which is what's being measured or observed. Think of the name dependent, it depends on the other variable. And then there's the control, which is the variable that doesn't get a certain treatment. Look for a 0 in the graph, or what they might call a sample trial. I'll be covering these types of questions in more detail in an upcoming video about the scientific method here. Check it out when it's posted, but these are some good terms to start with. Other recent test questions have asked about different taxonomic categories. Here's the mnemonic device I learned once upon a time. If you follow me down this first column, King Philip came over for a good soup. That's just the silly way I learned it, but those letters correspond to the different taxonomic categories: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Feel free to leave a comment below with whatever trick you learned from your bio class. So for example, we as humans are Homo sapiens. Homo is the name of our genus, and sapiens is the name of our species. And those terms have crept into some recent exams. The June 2017 and April 2019 tests wanted you to know that the last 2 words of an animal's name indicated its genus and its species. And some other animal classification terms have crept into other tests as well. A December 2013 question wanted you to know that birds are endothermic. Endothermic meaning warm-blooded, and ectothermic meaning cold-blooded. And the next few words all popped up on the June 2019 and July 2020 exams. An autotroph makes its own food, like plants. A heterotroph eats organic substances, and a detritivore obtains its energy by consuming decaying organic material. You might know the word detritus, meaning garbage. It's the same root. And the test can also ask about different types of relationships between animals, like symbiotic, parasitic, and commensalism. And here are a few more related animal topics that have appeared on recent exams. They asked about the fact that predator hunts prey. Also, the December 2016 exam wanted you to know that mammary glands would develop in mammals. And a December 2018 question wanted you to know about the food chain. In that food chain, consumers rely on other organisms for energy, consumers were on top of producers, and producers capture energy from the sun and provide it. And remember that in a food chain diagram, the arrow goes in the direction that the energy is flowing. Now that we've met some plants and animals, let's break down what's actually happening inside of their cells. The December 2018 test wanted you to know that plants and animal cells both have a nucleus, but only plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not. A July 2020 question threw in the fact that those cell walls are made of cellulose and not cholesterol. And another recent test question wanted you to know that osmosis happens through a cell membrane. And the April 2019 test threw in the fact that amoebas only have one cell and they also have a nucleus. Other questions might touch on the basics of cell division. Mitosis is cell division within the body. It creates an exact copy, or duplication, of the cell. It produces cells that are identical. Meiosis is the production of gametes. This does not create a direct copy, but it encourages variation in the cells, and it occurs within the sex cells. A nice way to remember that is think of mitosis as mitose, or, in other words, it happens in the body cells, not in the sex cells. That's meiosis. They could also ask about the 4 macromolecules. Proteins are made up of amino acids, carbohydrates are made up of simple sugars, and etc. with lipids and nucleic acids. Again, a recent test question wanted you to know that proteins were made up of amino acids, so it's definitely possible that a future test question could ask about the other macromolecules. And also, a June 2014 question threw in the fact that ATP is made up of lipids. Genetics is another very popular topic on the ACT. Here are some terms that have come up on recent tests. A genotype is the genetic makeup of a certain inheritable trait, such as eye color or hair color. It's represented as 2 letters, each of which is called an allele. If the genotype is homozygous, it contains the same 2 alleles, like big A, or little a. If the genotype is heterozygous, it contains 2 different alleles, like big A and little a. And in general, those are good prefixes to know. Homo meaning same, and hetero meaning different. We're going to see them again in just a little bit. Within each genotype, a capital letter means that the trait is dominant. A lowercase letter means that the trait is recessive. So for example, a capital B indicates brown eyes, and a lowercase b indicates blue eyes. In order for a dominant trait to appear, only one of those capital letters needs to be in the pair. But in order for the recessive trait to appear, both of the letters need to be lowercase. And once in a blue moon, they might ask you to work a genetic cross, which you might remember from when you learned about Punnett squares. If you feel shaky there, you can go back to your bio class notes as needed. And here are a few other related topics that have recently popped up on the test. A December 2017 question wanted you to know that a monocot is a plant containing an embryo with 1 seed leaf, while a dicot has 2 seed leaves. Again, the prefixes mono and di should help you out there. Another recent test question threw in the concept that a genetic mutation is caused by DNA damage. And a June 2015 question asked about natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which an organism that is better adapted to its environment is more likely to survive. As such, it's more likely to pass on its genes, so over time, the more favorable traits will show up more in that population. And one recent ACT was particularly mean, and it threw in a gene regulation chart. But most genetics questions will deal with the basics, like knowing the difference between dominant and recessive. Again, feel free to go back to your bio notes to brush up as needed. Now let's move from bio to chemistry. Let's start with pH levels. A neutral pH is 7. An acid has a pH lower than that, and a base has a pH higher than that. A nice way to remember that is alphabetical order. Acid before base, A before B, they go in order from acid to base. Other recent test questions have asked about different types of mixtures. Going back to the roots we saw before, a 2019 question wanted you to know that a homogeneous mixture would contain the same elements, while a heterogeneous mixture would contain varied elements. Again, homo meaning same, hetero, different. Another recent test question asked about solutions versus suspensions. A solution is a homogeneous mixture in which the particles are evenly dispersed. In other words, the particles are completely dissolved. So think about what happens when you mix sugar into coffee. After you stir it, it's all evenly mixed. A suspension is a heterogeneous mixture in which the particles are not evenly dispersed. So think about particles suspended in the river or soot in the air. Those are examples of suspensions where you still have solid particles. The test might also ask you about what's happening inside of an atom. Inside of an atom, the charge of a proton is positive, the charge of an electron is negative, like charges will repel, and opposite charges will attract. The April 2019 exam also wanted you to know that neutral atoms have no charge, while ions do have a charge. And the December 2018 test wanted you to recognize that this hydrogen ion would have a positive charge of positive 6. So if we added 3 electrons to it, it would be the same as subtracting 3, or having a final positive charge of 3. And speaking of that H, some test questions want you to know what certain chemical symbols mean. For example, a December 2020 question wanted you to recognize H2O as water, and another recent question wanted you to know that NaCl meant salt. Other questions will take those compounds and ask you to analyze a chemical reaction. Let's look at one. A chemical reaction might look something like this. The components to the left side of the arrow go into the reaction. Those are called the reactants. The chemical reaction produces the material on the right side of the arrow. These are called the products. So in this example, we are looking at the chemical reaction for hydrolysis. It starts with water and then produces hydrogen and oxygen. And the December 2017 test also threw in the term catalyst. A catalyst helps a chemical reaction, but it is neither a reactant nor a product. Now, some questions will ask you to go a little further and have you balance a chemical equation. In order to do that, we need to understand what the coefficients and the subscripts all mean. Subscripts indicate the smaller letters, such as that 4 after the bromine. They only apply to the element that they follow, and they indicate how many atoms of that element there are. And if there is no subscript, it means that there's really a 1 there. So in this first example, there is 1 carbon atom and 4 bromine atoms. So in any molecule, the ratio of carbon to bromine would be 1 to 4. Another recent test question wanted you to recognize that if the subscript changed from O8 to O6, it meant that the element lost oxygen atoms. So those are the subscripts. By contrast, the coefficients appear in front of the compound. So in the third line here, the 5 would be the coefficient. That tells you how many molecules you have of that compound. In this case, you would have 5 molecules of water. And that coefficient applies to all of the elements listed. And just like a subscript, if there is no coefficient there, it means it's a 1. So let's see how this ties into balancing a chemical equation. Let's go back to that chemical reaction that we saw before. This is a balanced chemical equation. Why? It's because the atoms have to add up to the same final number on each side. Let's check. On the left side of the arrow, that coefficient of 2 in front of the water molecule would get multiplied to each subscript in that compound. So for the hydrogen, 2 times 2 would give us 4 atoms of hydrogen on the left side. And that matches with the right side. On the right side of the equation, that coefficient of 2 in front of the hydrogen gets multiplied by that subscript of 2, also giving us 4 atoms. So that's balanced. And the oxygen checks out as well. So on the left, that coefficient of 2 would get multiplied by the hidden subscript of 1, giving us 2 oxygen atoms on that side. And on the right side, there's really a coefficient of 1 in front of the oxygen. Multiplying that coefficient by the subscript of 2 would give us 2 atoms of oxygen on the right side as well. So these are balanced chemical equations. But some questions will ask you to go a step beyond that. Let's try one. If the experiment above produces 30 liters of H2, how many liters of O2 are produced? I'll give you a second. Press pause, give it a shot. Look at the coefficients on the right. We are producing 2 molecules of H2 for every 1 molecule of O2. That ratio always has to be 2 to 1. So if we are producing 30 liters of H2, we know that has to be double the amount of O2. So the answer is 15. That maintains our ratio of 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen. Other recent test questions have asked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is the process by which a plant takes on carbon dioxide and water, and with the help of light and chlorophyll, produces glucose and oxygen. Cellular respiration happens in animals, and it's just the backwards version of that. Glucose and oxygen are converted into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And another recent test question wanted you to know that photosynthesis occurs above the ground, because it needs the sun. And a 2017 question threw in the term phototropism, which is the growth of an organism in response to a light stimulus. So basically, a plant that is above ground will exhibit positive phototropism since it grows towards the light. And the July 2020 test threw in the terms exothermic and endothermic. An exothermic reaction is one that releases heat, and an endothermic reaction absorbs heat. So those are some of the ways that they might ask you about chemical symbols and chemical reactions. Now let's look at different types of matter and energy. Some questions just want you to know the basics, like evaporating means turning from a liquid into a gas, or that melting turns solid water into a liquid. But other questions might ask about the specific temperatures where those happen. The boiling point of water is 212 Fahrenheit, or 100 Celsius, and the freezing point is 32 Fahrenheit, or 0 Celsius. A December 2018 question also wanted you to recognize that if something is a gas, it meant that the temperature was already above the boiling point. And a December 2020 question threw in the fact that when you heat water, molecules would absorb energy, which gets converted into kinetic energy. This then changes from the liquid to the gas and bubbles into vapor. Other recent test questions have asked about these specific types of energy. Potential energy is stored energy, like waiting to drop at the top of a roller coaster. Kinetic energy is energy in motion, or the energy as the roller coaster falls. So they might want you to know that gravitational potential energy would be highest right before an object drops, and then it decreases as the object falls. Likewise, a recent test question wanted you to see that when you compress a spring, the potential energy would also increase. And staying in this family, a 2016 question threw in the term drag force. A drag force is a force that, well, drags. So, for example, a drag force would slow down a fish swimming in the water. A 2017 question threw in the term buoyancy, which is the force that pushes back up in a liquid. So if you push a basketball down into a swimming pool, the buoyancy pushes the ball back up. And an older test question threw in the concept of friction, which is another force that slows you down. So if you push an object across a table, the friction will eventually cause it to stop. And then there is the law of the conservation of mass and the conservation of total mechanical energy. Basically, mass and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. They're always converted from one form to another. That concept popped up on a December 2015 question. And staying on the concept of energy transfer, other questions have touched on the following. Conduction is the transfer of heat through physical contact. For example, when you heat a frying pan, the handle gets hot. That happens because of the molecules touching other molecules. This happens in solids. Convection is the transfer of heat through a fluid medium. This happens in liquid and gases. This helps to explain why water in a pool is always warmer on top than it is on the bottom. The warm water is less dense, so it rises to the surface. The cool water is more dense, so it goes to the bottom. This creates a convection current. And radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. And speaking of waves, other questions, like June 2020, wanted you to know about waves as well. You might remember some of these from your trig class when you learned about the sine and the cosine curve. The amplitude is how tall the graph is, or its vertical distance from the midline. The wavelength is like the period of a trig curve. It measures how long it takes the curve to repeat. Think of it as the distance from peak to the next peak. And the frequency is how many times the curve repeats within a given stretch. And once in a while, they'll ask about conductivity. December 2019 wanted you to know that water has fewer ions than NaOH, which meant that it had a lower conductivity. And a few questions from 2020 asked about how a battery would provide electricity. They wanted you to know that a conductor does better with lower resistance, while an insulator does better with a higher resistance. Other recent test questions have asked about geology, or basic properties of the Earth. So it's good to be familiar with the terms erosion, faulting, plate tectonics, and volcanism. And in terms of the Earth itself, other questions might want you to be familiar with the concepts of longitude and latitude. And an April 2019 question wanted you to know that a compass is best affected by a magnetic field. Now let's move away from the planet and into astronomy. Here's the mnemonic device I once learned to remember the order of the planets. My very excellent mother just served us 9 pizzas. Unfortunately, that no longer works because Pluto was demoted. So feel free to comment down below with whatever trick you learned to remember the order of the planets. But either way, they correspond to the planets in order: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Now, an April 2009 question wanted you to identify outer planets versus inner planets. The first 4 are called the inner planets, and the other 4 are called outer planets. And the same question wanted you to know that Saturn was a gas giant. The last four are the gas giants, and the first four are called terrestrial. And a July 2020 question touched on the fact that Venus was closer to the Sun than Earth. And an April 2018 question threw in the term new moon. New moon refers to the phase of the moon when there is no moon, or when you can't see it. Other questions might ask what instruments would be best to measure something. For example, they might want you to know that a balance would be used to measure mass and not a pH meter. Common sense, but they could ask that. Other questions might ask you to do some metric conversions. For example, what is 0.047 kilometers in centimeters, or what is 28 millimeters in meters? In order to do these conversions, it helps to use the letters on top. The mnemonic device I learned in school was King Henry's daughter usually drinks chocolate milk. These letters stand for the prefixes of each unit: kilo, hecto, deca, and then the U, which is the unit by itself, deci, centi, and milli. Feel free to comment below with whatever trick you learned. The thing to remember is that you move the decimal the same number of places that you move within the letters. So for example, to convert from 0.047 kilometers to centimeters, you would need to determine how many letters away the K is from the C. So if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 5 letters away. That means you would move the decimal 5 spots to the right. So 0.047 kilometers would give us 4,700 centimeters. Likewise, if we went the other way, to convert 28 millimeters to meters, we are moving from the M on the right 3 spots back to the left, back to the U. So moving that decimal 3 spots would make 28 millimeters into 0.028 meters. Now, when measuring things, the terms accuracy and precision might appear. This distinction came up on the December 2018 test. Accuracy relates to how close the measurement is to the true value, where precision is how close the measurements are to each other. So for accuracy, let's say that the true measurement of a substance was 55 grams, and then you measure it to be 51 grams. That measurement would not be very accurate. But for precision, you're trying to see if you can consistently measure the same value each time. So let's say every time you measure it, you keep getting 51 grams. You would have a high degree of precision, but not a high degree of accuracy. And the December 2019 test also threw in the concept of significant digits. Significant digits indicate how many digits you use to give a ballpark estimate of a number, so to speak. So if you had a measurement of 12.37196, blah, 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 you might just call it 12.37 just to simplify things. That would give you 4 significant digits. It's the number of digits you use to estimate the final amount. Now this can get a little tricky if they end that decimal with a 0. A 0 is still considered a part of the significant digits. So that answer that lists 71.0 means that they wanted to know what the 10th place was. So 71.0 would be 3 significant digits and not 2. And finally, some questions might ask that you perform some basic math steps, like finding a percent or some operations with fractions. Keep in mind that you can't use a calculator on the science section, but still, the computation in this section won't be too tough. Whew, we made it. I know this went a little longer than usual, but this was a great review of what outside science topics have appeared on the ACT in recent years. If we hit a topic that you didn't know, then hit that like button. And again, leave a comment below to let us know if you spotted any of these topics on your test. Or tell us what other random topics popped up on your exam. It'll help other students as they cram for the next round. And be sure to check out my science playlist where I cover the other types of science questions that you'll see on the ACT. Thanks for watching. And remember, plan your work, work your plan.